There comes a moment, often uninvited, rarely convenient, when the veil is torn. That which was hidden emerges, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, searing intensity. One awakens. But this awakening is not the dawn that many imagine, filled with radiant purpose or celestial clarity. Instead, it is an undoing. You may find, strangely, that you no longer care about what once stirred you into action. The ambitions that once dictated your every move now seem hollow. The voices that praise you have fallen silent. And worst of all, the inner fire that once propelled you forward seems extinguished. The experience of a spiritual awakening is often portrayed as a moment of clarity, bliss, and profound connection with a greater reality. Yet, what is rarely spoken of is the disorienting aftermath that follows such a moment. The first keynote, the collapse of the ego's old structure, is not a metaphorical concept, but a lived psychological and existential reality for those who have touched something beyond the confines of their conditioned self. This collapse is not a sudden disappearance, but an unraveling, often slow and painful, in which the scaffolding that once held the individual together begins to dissolve. The ego, up until this point, had operated as the central organizing force in one's psyche. It constructed narratives, ambitions, roles, and identities that gave the illusion of coherence and purpose. It derived motivation from success, recognition, and control. But when a spiritual awakening strikes, the ego no longer holds the same power or relevance. Its values become transparent, its voice weaker, and its logic insufficient. The ego is not inherently evil or wrong. It is necessary for functioning in the world. However, it is limited. It sees itself as the entirety of the self, when in fact it is only a fragment. For much of one's life, the ego defines what is real and what is worth striving for. It collects roles: the achiever, the lover, the hero, the victim. It gathers experiences and turns them into stories about who we are. These stories, while often necessary for early development, become rigid containers over time. We believe we must continue the narrative. We believe we must become someone by fulfilling these egoic ideals. But the spiritual awakening introduces a rupture in this continuity. It is as if a deeper part of the psyche, older, more authentic, and connected to the totality of being, emerges and throws into question everything the ego has built. At the moment of awakening, one may experience a glimpse of unity, timelessness, or vast interior depths. However, once the peak passes, the return to ordinary consciousness is often accompanied by an overwhelming sense of detachment from the previous motivations. It is not that the person has become apathetic, rather they can no longer lie to themselves about what matters. The pursuit of material success, the need for social validation, or the endless striving for perfection, these begin to appear as shadows on the wall, no longer capable of sustaining real engagement. The ego, having lost its centrality, is confused, threatened, and eventually fatigued. Motivation collapses because the structures that once energized the will are no longer believable. One cannot return to the old way of living with the same enthusiasm because something in the soul refuses to cooperate. This collapse often brings about a kind of existential vacuum. What previously gave direction now feels hollow. One may look around and see the world continuing its habitual patterns, people chasing goals, speaking in cliches, performing roles, but internally there is a fracture. The individual no longer knows what to want. They are no longer convinced by the rewards that once seemed so meaningful. This is not depression in the clinical sense. It is a profound psychological reorientation. The center has shifted, and with it, the entire psychic architecture begins to wobble. The difficulty lies in the fact that, while the egoic system has lost its power, the deeper self has not yet fully emerged as a stable source of direction. Thus, the person is caught in an in-between space, where the old has died, but the new has not yet been born. This death of the ego's old structure is akin to a symbolic descent into the underworld. Myths and religious texts across cultures speak of such descents, of gods who must die, heroes who must journey through darkness, prophets who wander in deserts. These are not merely external stories, they reflect internal psychic processes. The spiritual awakening begins a kind of inner death, where what one took to be real and solid crumbles under the weight of something more profound. It is not a punishment, but a necessary purgation. In order for a new, more authentic mode of being to arise, the false structures must be allowed to fall apart. However, this collapse does not occur in a neat or linear fashion. It is often accompanied by confusion, doubt, and fear. The ego resists its dissolution. It will attempt to reassert itself through subtle forms of control or spiritualized ambition. One may try to turn awakening into a new identity, a new performance. But if the awakening was genuine, these efforts eventually fail. The soul demands truth, not pretense. The inner self cannot be bargained with. It calls for surrender, not strategy. And in that surrender, motivation, as previously understood, disappears, not because there is nothing left to do, but because the inner compass has changed. The absence of motivation should not be mistaken for failure or regression. It is the natural consequence of psychic reorganization. What is happening is not the void, but a clearing. In the space left behind by the ego's collapse, something deeper is attempting to emerge, but this emergence is not immediate. The deeper self speaks a different language, one of silence, symbols, images, and intuitions. It moves slowly, organically, and often beneath the threshold of awareness. It cannot be summoned through willpower or forced effort. Therefore, in the early stages after awakening, the person feels suspended, disconnected from the world and from themselves. They may long for the familiar motivations to return, but they no longer fit the psychic landscape. This is why the collapse of the ego structure is both liberating and terrifying. It liberates because it opens the door to a deeper, more truthful life. It terrifies because it strips away everything that once gave a sense of self. One may feel naked, unprotected, unsure of how to act. And yet, this state of inner vulnerability is fertile ground for transformation. It is the soil in which a new form of motivation can grow, not one based on fear or desire, but on resonance, alignment, and authenticity. But before that seed can take root, the old must be allowed to decompose. The ego must relinquish its throne. Only then can the self begin to speak. Following a spiritual awakening, an individual often encounters not just the dissolution of the ego's old framework, but also the quiet emergence of something far more profound. The self, unlike the ego, which functions as a surface level coordinator of identity, the self is the totality of the psyche, including both conscious and unconscious elements. It is not a concept, but a living reality that reveals itself gradually, sometimes through dreams, intuitions, or an unshakable sense of presence. This encounter with the transpersonal self is not usually dramatic or loud. It does not impose itself like the ego. Rather, it waits, it calls, it draws the individual inward with a subtle but persistent gravity. And in that gravitational pull, the entire nature of motivation begins to change. The old fuel, external validation, ambition, fear, comparison, no longer ignites the psyche as it once did. Instead, motivation must now arise from a deeper source, one that is unfamiliar, timeless, and often paradoxically still. When the self emerges, it does so not as a new identity to be grasped, but as a center to be listened to. It has no interest in achievement for its own sake. It is not concerned with appearances, competition, or worldly recognition. The self seeks wholeness, not victory. Its voice is not urgent, but enduring. And so the individual who has had a spiritual awakening finds themselves in a strange and often disconcerting position. They can no longer rely on the same strategies they used to animate their lives. What used to motivate them now feels artificial or irrelevant. Even goals that once appeared noble or inspiring may seem empty if they are not rooted in inner truth. This change can bring about a deep sense of confusion or inertia because the new source of motivation, the self, requires a different mode of engagement altogether. It does not push, it invites, it does not demand, it beckons. This inward shift does not happen smoothly. The ego, having lost its grip, still tries to reclaim its role by interpreting the encounter with the self in its own terms. It may try to turn spiritual insight into an achievement or claim the awakening as a badge of superiority, but the self cannot be manipulated. It is not a tool of the ego, it is the container within which the ego itself exists. Therefore, any attempt to use it for personal gain quickly leads to frustration, and the sense of motivation continues to elude the individual. This tension between the ego's desire for action and the self's insistence on alignment creates a kind of psychic paralysis. One feels cold, but to what? One feels changed, but has no map for the new terrain. The motivations of the past are no longer trustworthy, and the motivations of the self are still emerging. This transitional phase often feels like being suspended between two realities. The outer world continues to value productivity, visibility, and measurable success, but the inner world, newly awakened, now speaks a different language. It values presence, depth, sincerity, and mystery. The self does not offer quick answers or five-step plans. It reveals itself over time through the slow unfolding of experience. This can be deeply unsettling to someone who is used to planning and executing their life with clarity and control. But the self demands something else entirely: surrender. It asks for a willingness to not know, to not act prematurely, to sit in silence long enough for authentic desire to rise from within rather than be imposed from without. This encounter with the self often begins in subtle ways. One might find themselves drawn to certain images, symbols, or intuitions without fully understanding why. There may be an inexplicable yearning to create, to heal, to withdraw, or to serve, not because it fulfills an egoic fantasy, but because it resonates at a deep inner level. These promptings are not commands, they are whispers, and unless one is attuned to them, they can easily be drowned out by the noise of habit or the pressure of expectation. Thus, the challenge becomes one of discernment. The individual must learn to distinguish between the remnants of egoic desire and the emerging impulses of the self. This is not easy. It requires patience, inner honesty, and often a willingness to disappoint others in order to remain true to oneself. Because the self moves slowly and organically. Motivation after a spiritual awakening cannot be forced. It must be allowed to arise. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson to internalize. In a world that prizes immediate action and visible results, waiting for inner clarity can feel like failure or laziness. But in reality, it is a form of discipline, far more demanding than impulsive effort. It requires the courage to not act until there is inner alignment. And once alignment is felt, the action that follows is not mechanical or strained. It is natural, powerful, and deeply satisfying. Motivation born of the self does not burn out quickly. It is sustainable because it is rooted in authenticity. However, until this deeper alignment stabilizes, the individual often feels like they are in limbo. They may experience periods of great clarity, followed by stretches of uncertainty. They may be inspired one day and immobilized the next. This fluctuation is not a sign of regression, but of integration. The psyche is learning to orient itself around a new center, the nervous system, the emotional body, the mental framework. All must adjust to this new reality. And during this adjustment, The experience of motivation will be inconsistent at best. But what matters is not the consistency of external activity, but the depth of inner listening. Each moment of stillness, of inward attention, creates space for the self to speak more clearly. Eventually, motivation reemerges, but it is transformed. It no longer comes from a sense of lack or need to prove something. It arises from a quiet joy, a felt sense of purpose that may not even be. The self does not require that one understand the entire journey before taking a step. It only asks that the step be taken in truth. And so the individual begins to live differently. Actions become expressions of inner alignment rather than strategies for external validation. Choices are guided not by fear or ambition, but by resonance, even if the outer life appears simpler or less productive by societal standards. The inner life deepens and becomes fertile. This depth is the true measure of motivation after awakening, not how much one does, but how deeply one lives. The self will continue to call, and each response to that call deepens the bond between the conscious ego and the unconscious ground of being. This relationship is dynamic. It evolves. And as it does, motivation becomes less about doing and more about being. One learns to trust that the right actions will emerge naturally from the right state of being. In this sense, the self does not abolish motivation, it redeems it, it purifies it of falsehood, and reclaims it for truth. And that truth is not abstract, it is felt, it is lived, it is the silent knowing that one is, at last, moving in harmony with the whole of oneself. And so, if you find yourself stripped of direction after spiritual awakening, if the old desires have faded and nothing new has yet taken their place, understand that you are not broken and you are not lost. You are being reoriented towards something deeper. The collapse of egoic motivation is not the end, but the beginning of a more authentic journey, one guided not by fear or illusion, but by the quiet voice of the self. This voice may not shout, but it will always tell the truth. In listening to it, even through silence, you are returning to your center. You are becoming whole. Good luck on your inner path. Trust the stillness and give yourself the grace to not rush the unfolding. The soul moves at a different pace than the world. Thank you for walking this road with sincerity. Your courage to face the unknown is itself a light for others.